Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today, man, I have a very special guest. You've seen him on this show a lot. It's my friend and brother, scholar, author, organizer, Pan-African, Dwayne Omowale. Thank you for coming through, brother.
Appreciate it. It's always glad to be here.
Yeah, man, it's always dope to have you, man. Before we get started, man, how are you? How is everything going your way?
I'm doing well. Just staying busy with all the different Pan African work that I'm trying to get done.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, man, and we definitely appreciate all of your efforts. I wanted to have this conversation here because South Africa has been in the news a lot lately, and we're going to get to why. But first, I kind of want to like just take it back from the beginning, just so to bring people up to speed who may not, know some of that history. So when we think about apartheid in South Africa, um, for someone who may have never read anything on South African apartheid or only heard about it in passing, how would you describe South African apartheid to someone who doesn't know?
So I would describe it as white minority rule. I think that's usually the most common description that we hear about that. And what that means is a situation where white people in South Africa, being the minority in the country, were the majority in terms of people who were in the positions of power, people making the decisions in terms of who controls the politics, who controls the government, and who controls the finances of the country.
Right, right. Now, when we look at that power dynamic, from when we look at that power dynamic, with white minority rule in a black nation, right? For those that don't know, like this was not like some peaceful transfer of power. Like this was violent, correct?
Extremely violent.
Right.
Yeah, because and when you study the history of apartheid, because even before you get to the apartheid regime, you have to look at colonialism and how white people even came to that position of power. So basically, what they did was went into South Africa and stole the land, conquered the people, and it was very brutal and destructive. When you actually get into the history of what they were doing, slaughtering people would deliberately target villages. Just go in there, attack villages, destroy crops, and starve people. Like those were the type of tactics that these people were engaged in. And why I think it's important to understand the tactics that they were using is, particularly when we look at the history of South Africa and how Africans engaged in warfare in that region of Africa, it was unusual that you would attack civilians as part of the warfare. That Africans, even in war, had a code of conduct. So typically, wars would be among the warriors on the battlefield. The warriors would agree to have that meeting on the battlefield, go out and fight out the differences. So when the Europeans got there, the Europeans were engaging in war tactics that Africans just weren't accustomed to dealing with in a war type setting. So it's important to make that point that not only was the colonization of South Africa very brutal, but it was something that Africans weren't necessarily prepared for when they were engaging in initial resistance against Europeans, because Africans weren't accustomed to fighting an enemy that was as brutal as European colonizers that came into South Africa were.
I think that's definitely something that I want the people to think about. I've read books on warfare in Africa, and in pre-colonial times, it wasn't out of the norm for a war to maybe only have one or two casualties, if any.
Yep.
And so, can you imagine with that history, and then you witness a whole new level of brutality from European colonizers. Um, that's 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 definitely an overwhelming experience. It's something out. It's something that you didn't. It's something that our people in South Africa didn't even see in the realm of possibilities. You know what I mean?
Yeah, throughout the rest of the continent, Namibia, where the Germans carried out that genocide against the Herero people.
Hmm.
And an important part of that history is when the Herero people were engaged in the initial conflict with the Germans, what they were trying to do was come to a peace settlement, because traditionally how they handled their warfare is you go to battle, have the confrontation, you fight, and then it's supposed to end with a peace. So
Mm.
as the Herero people are crafting the peace settlement with the Germans are plotting genocide. So that shows you the difference in the mentality. So it happened in South Africa, but really it was the case throughout the continent that Africans were just dealing with an enemy that's far more brutal and destructive than anything that it had been accustomed to dealing with. So I mentioned that as a very important historical background to really set the tone for why apartheid was so brutal for African people, because it was a level of brutality that African people were not accustomed to. But also, I think it's important to make that point is one of the justifications for apartheid and justification for colonialism is this idea that Africans were so savage and so backwards that Europeans needed to come and to civilize African people. And the other justification is, well, Africans were conquering each other and oppressing each other before white people got there. So it's important to understand that whatever warfare and colonialism existed among Africans was nowhere near the same degree of what Europeans did when they came and conquered Africa. So, it's important to understand this history as a part of a counter to those justifications for apartheid and a counter to those justifications for colonialism, because the reality is the people who claim that they were coming to Africa to civilize us were nowhere near being civilized themselves.
Right, right. And they use that same talking point whenever they're discussing indigenous people in North America, right? They like to say, well, they were warring with each other and they were this and they were that. As if, first off, as if they were doing that in Europe. You know what I mean? But secondly, it's always used as any type of conflict within a community or a nation is always used as the justification that they are savage and they are in need of civilization. When we know that's just a cloak, obviously, to conquer, steal, exploit. One of the justifications that I see, and they are kind of ramping this up a lot lately. Um, White colonizers in South Africa are making this claim that they were in South Africa before the Zulus. Have you ever heard them say that?
Not the Zulus specifically, but I've heard that argument that they claim that and then the reason why they make this claim is this idea that they just came to South Africa and they found empty land. And they just
Mm-hmm.
went there, they took the empty land,
Mm-hmm.
and certain Africans who were settlers actually settled into that area after the white people came and took the land. But again, that's why I started with the history, because if the land was empty, why would you have to go there and slaughter people and starve them off of the land?
Right.
If the land was empty, you just show up and you settle in the land. You don't have to run people off of their land.
Right.
If it was like that. So I've never heard with the Zulus, but I have heard the claim that, well, they didn't steal the land; they just went and settled on occupied empty land.
And it's so funny. Like I saw a conversation between a white colonizer in South Africa and an archaeologist, and he was talking about how like quote unquote Bantu people like were there like 1,300 years before any European colonizer, and it's so funny like how. And I'm not going to get too far off topic because today's show is about South Africa and its history. But it's crazy how we laugh at a lot of the pseudo commentary in our own community sometimes. But don't get me wrong, they create a history that never happened in order to justify their position on this planet. And I saw a guy, he was a PhD, a professor, and he was trying to make the claim that Mansa Musa was a white man. And it's like, he had followers who believed that as if there was a white man that was going to be the leader of Mali, right? I mean, that it's just even thinking about that is insane. But it just goes to show that for whatever agenda they have, they don't mind creating a history and narrative to justify that agenda.
Yeah, that's exactly true. And what's interesting about that is a lot of times when we deal with pseudo history in our own community, and you check where these people are getting the information from, oftentimes it's the same Europeans.
Yeah, it's them. Yeah. That's a fact. That's a fact. It's them. um, you know, and so those same people who are creating this history and narrative that they just settled in parts of South Africa. Nobody was on this land. Obviously, you dispelled that just for the idea of their need for violence, their need to conquer, right? Because if there was nobody there to be violent towards, and nobody to conquer, then you would have just settled there and peacefully, right? Um, and so, when we hear talks about, uh, okay, actually, I'm gonna. So when we hear talks about expropriating the land back from white colonizers, right? I've seen commentary on white leftists, white socialists, white communists, not all, but I've seen some say that this act in itself is racist. Um, how how would you respond to that if you were in a conversation with a white leftist that had that point of view?
How did the white people get the land?
Right.
I think that's the most obvious. But I mean, I think the other angle I would approach it at as well is just flip the situation. Would white people tolerate if foreign people came into their territory and took their land? And we have an answer to that because Spain, we saw how Spain handled the Moors. That after
Mhm.
several, and the Moors were there a lot longer. After 700 years, once the Spanish regained power in Spain, they kicked all the Moors out.
Right, right, right. And so historically, we can see what they would
So
do,
yeah,
right?
basically, what white people have never done. And an interesting thing too, about the Spanish situation is that the Moors were there long enough that they intermarried with the Spanish. So some of the Spanish that were kicking the Moors out were Spaniards that actually had Moorish ancestry.
Absolutely.
That didn't matter. Ultimately, what mattered to them was the land and regaining the culture and the purity of the European culture, which is why they wanted to kick the foreign influence out. So we know where Europeans are concerned, they would never tolerate a situation like that, and it wouldn't matter how long the foreign presence had been on the land. But with African people, it's always this mentality of, okay, well, yeah, we came in, we stole your land, but that was back then. You can't be racist to us now. Just accept
Right.
the fact that we're already here and we have the land. You can't do anything to us with the land now because if you did so, it'd be racism or reverse racism or whatever
Mhm.
justification they try to
Oh,
do.
I'm glad you
So,
said that. I've seen white colonizers in South Africa use the term reverse apartheid.
yeah.
That's so crazy to me, man. It's like they have a lot of audacity to even
But
come up with a term like that,
and
man.
this is why the history is so important because if we're being real about the history of what apartheid was, reverse apartheid would be a bunch of South Africans going to England, running the
Mm,
English people off of their land, and then establishing a black government oppressing the English people. That's reverse apartheid. So
right.
that's why we need to be honest about what this history was because a lot of times when they do the whole reverse racism, reverse apartheid, they're not really being honest about what racism actually is, what apartheid actually is. So if a white person is telling me about you being a reverse racist, show me where I've established a Jim Crow system, show me apartheid, show me where I've established chattel slavery of white people. Because as Kwame Ture always pointed out, racism isn't just an attitude; it's a question of power. So
Hmm.
show me where African people have created a system where we're actually exercising power at the expense of Europeans.
Right.
To me, that's reverse racism.
Do you see a lot of similarities between South African apartheid and Jim Crow in America?
So there are a lot of similarities, and that's by design because essentially what white people in South Africa did when they were crafting apartheid is they looked at the Jim Crow system in the United States and found ways to essentially perfect that system. And the reason why I say that is because Marcus Garvey actually he mentioned this in one of his speeches where his organization had adopted a position where it was almost like accepting the one drop rule, where
Mhm.
Garvey felt like if you were mixed race, he'd want you in the organization. And the reason why Garvey did that is because he made the point that in South Africa's racial classifications are different. Historically in the United States, because of one drop, anybody with African ancestry was black, no matter how far removed it was. You could be a quarter, even 1/8 black, and you're still black under the one drop rule.
Mhm.
But in South Africa, they did a different racial classification by design, because what the white people in South Africa realized from looking at the situation of Jim Crow in America is that if you do that and you classify biracial people and mixed people as black, they're
Mhm.
going to align as being black and fight for black rights the same way as a black person would,
Mhm.
because they're equally oppressed. So
Right.
they came up with a separate color scheme where if you were mixed, you're colored, and
Yeah.
colored had certain advantages. Color wasn't white. You weren't
Mhm.
fully in the position of power, but being colored, you had advantages that a black person in South Africa wouldn't have. So they were looking at the Jim Crow system and finding ways to perfect it to make it even more effective in South Africa. So when Garvey saw that, Garvey realized that the whole color scheme that white people were using was a divide and conquer tactic, because it's easy to take this for granted in the United States, but outside of the United States, the one drop rule does not exist. So
Right.
what you find is like South Africa, where if you're mixed, you tend not to be classified as being black, and it creates all
Mhm.
kinds of conditions within those groups. But in the case of South Africa, they very deliberately did that because they didn't want the mixed race population in South Africa aligning with the black cause, as was the case in the United States. And it was also important because, unlike the United States, white people in South Africa were the minority, so they needed divide and rule to engage in that. And the reality is, a lot of us don't think about this. Like, again, from the American perspective, we kind of take it for granted that white people are the majority group in America.
Mhm.
Globally, white people are a minority, so
Yeah.
globally, white people have always had to use divide and conquer to retain their power. But in South Africa, we see that it was a very deliberate divide and conquer system, and part of how they were able to craft that system is by learning from what was being done with Jim Crow in the United States.
Yeah. Do you remember the big controversy, like well, just in pop culture, probably sometime early in 2024, when the South African singer Tyla said she wasn't black, she was colored,
Yeah, I
and
remember that.
the diaspora was like, "What the hell is she talking about?" Like they didn't understand, um, because here, like if she was born in Cleveland, she would be considered a black woman.
Yeah,
I think also that's why it's important for us to understand that just even the idea of blackness doesn't really have a scientific uh like there's blackness is different pretty much. I wouldn't say everywhere you go, but it's different all over the world, right? like
yeah.
like in Cuba, there's, I mean, racial classifications. I did the show on Afro Mexico, and there's degrees of varying degrees of blackness, right? In a lot of different cultures, especially like in Latin America. But it's
Brazil is crazy. Brazil's got over 100 different classifications of blackness.
damn, damn. See, yeah, right. And I think we have to. I honestly think it's time for us to shed that. And
But and that's why I mentioned Garvey. Garvey's in your position, and I talked to some brothers who probably don't agree with Garvey in this, because Garvey was really extreme in terms of how he was approaching the one drop rule. But Garvey spoke about the 100% African and the 1% African uniting to liberate Africa. And I don't know about you. I've never met somebody who's 1% black who's for African
no,
liberation. But
absolutely.
but but I mean, that's how Garvey felt about it. Garvey, and
Yeah.
I mean, but Garvey had a point though, because Garvey recognized that that is something that's been used to divide African people globally. This, different classification of the blackness, particularly in Brazil, because as you would imagine, if you have over 100 different classifications for blackness and all kinds of confusion about who's black and who isn't black, it's very difficult to organize black people in
Hmm.
that context. And there's a Brazilian activist, Anna Roland, that spoke about this. She said part of why it's such a challenge for black people in Brazil to really organize, even though black people in Brazil are a majority. It's the question of, well, who's black and who actually isn't black. And she herself said that how it works in Brazil is, in some parts of Brazil she's a black woman, in other parts of Brazil she's white.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it's very difficult to organize with that confusion. So Garvey understood that we need to really put an end to the colorism and all these kind of divisions about complexion and
Hmm.
biological purity of Africanness, to really build a global unified Black movement for the collective liberation of our people.
Yeah. I mean, if you're in the diaspora, regardless, if you're in the diaspora and you are a descendant of enslaved Africans, there's going to be some admixture somewhere.
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying? there's obviously even places that white people colonized in Africa. There's going to be some admixture on the continent.
South Africa, I mean, the Portuguese colonies as well. That was very common among
Mm.
the Portuguese colonies.
Yeah, yeah, right, right, right. Yeah, that's a definitely an old playbook. I think it reinforces the idea that again, we have to define who we are for ourselves. And one thing that there's no varying degrees of, in my opinion, is being African, identifying as an African, right? Like if I'm an African, I'm not part African, no matter what admixture I have from being in the diaspora. We are African people, and I think that's very important. Like not to get too far off because we're gonna, we got some more questions about South Africa, but all right. So like even seeing like what's going on in South Africa and how you said the similarities between Jim Crow and South African apartheid, um, and how even South African apartheid, because it began in 48, right? Like officially till about 94. Um, and Jim Crow Jim Crow was a well-oiled machine in the South by then, in the fact that South Africans could look, I'm sorry, white colonizers in South Africa could look at the Jim Crow South and get inspiration, learn strategy, the same way Nazi Germany did. Not to go too far, but what does that say about Jim Crow in America and what happened here? Like for for it to inspire or has at least serve as some inspiration for Nazi Germany and South African apartheid. Like that says a lot, right?
Yeah, and this is why I'm always an advocate for, as Black people, it's important that we study and understand our own history, but also study and understand the history of white people. And
Mm,
what you find is they build systems upon systems upon systems. So the United States, I always make this point that when you look at the history of the United States, the founders of the United States were looking at Greece and Rome for their influences. So they built their government off of those influences, and we see the system building on itself. So you mentioned, for example, Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, took some influences from Jim Crow. It also took influences from the Roman Empire. It saw
mm,
itself as a continuation of the Roman Empire.
mm-hmm,
So it's important to understand that when we're dealing with white supremacists, they study the history well enough to know how to effectively build systems, and they take they look at the history and they take things that work and they discard things that don't work or might not be as practical for modern day circumstances. So that's basically what the United States was created as. I always refer to the United States as basically a continuation of the Roman Empire. The British Empire was a continuation of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was that foundational basis for Western imperialism, for Western Empire, and it just keeps building on itself. So that Jim Crow system was one of those things that other Western empires, other white supremacist societies were able to look at and to build from. And even Brazil, I mentioned Brazil, that even Brazil had its own approach to white supremacy that differed from the United States. And the reason why it differed is because the white supremacists in Brazil were looking at Jim Crow and they realized, well, if you segregate the black population, you're always going to have a black population. So
mm.
the mentality in Brazil is we'll just assimilate them and eventually they'll disappear and they'll become white.
Wow, wow,
So
wow.
that's what I mean. White supremacists study each other's systems and they try to build and perfect their own systems.
I was scrolling down my timeline today and I saw a sister wearing a hoodie and it has a phrase on it that I hate more than anything. And it said, um, we are not our ancestors. We'll F you up. We have, as a whole, this generation hasn't shown a third of the resiliency our ancestors and fighting spirit that our ancestors did.
Not I mean that could be a whole separate show by itself. But I mean, I just that bothers me on so because and here's why one of the things that bothers me, like you said, not only because we're not showing that resiliency of the ancestors, but also because we don't need to.
Mm,
We're not dealing with the same oppression
right.
that our ancestors were dealing with, and the reason why we're not is because they fought it. So
Yeah.
it's almost a
Yeah.
situation where it's not only disrespectful to the ancestors because they are actually, fighting battles that we will never have to fight, but it's disrespectful from the standpoint of our ancestors fought those battles so that we don't have to fight them.
Yeah.
They fought those things so that we don't actually have to beat them. We don't have to, go through the things that they went through. So it, I don't like it, but then it goes back to the point I was making that white supremacists, they know how to build on the systems that they've established. And with us, it's almost a struggle because we don't know our history well enough to build on top of the history.
Right.
Because if you know the history of our struggle and everything that we've gone through, you should never be trying to compare yourself to the ancestors in that way, anyways. What you should be thinking about is how can I build on the legacy that the ancestors left? How can I continue their work?
Hmm.
It should never be a comparison where well, I'm not my ancestor, I'm better. Because I
Yeah.
mean, it's even stupid to think about it on that level. Like, how are you better than your ancestors? You wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the ancestors to begin with. So why even make it a
Right.
competition? It's unfortunate that we do that, but like I said, with white supremacists, they don't treat their ancestors that way. And I'm speaking from experience. Going to predominantly white schools, the way they teach European history is in a way where they're trying to get the white students to internalize the legacy of white supremacy and to
Mm.
understand what it is and to find their place in white supremacy and to build on it. So they're teaching white children the history to build on top of what white people have accomplished. And then for many of us, we just don't study history, so we think we need to be in competition with the ancestors, which makes no sense when you really
No.
think about that. But yeah, you're right. I don't like it because we're not showing the same resiliency that the ancestors showed, and there's no excuse for it because we're in a much better position than they're in. I mean, we're having conversations like this in public online. We
Right.
don't have to go
Right.
hide in these secret meetings to have these kind of conversations,
We
and
could
that's
read.
that's
We can read out in
yeah.
open.
You could read out in the open. Don't have to hide and do religious meetings because again, this is history. I don't know how many of our people know about, but the Black Church, at some point, even church gatherings were banned. So
Absolutely.
and you know how Black people, we love
Yeah.
church.
Yeah.
Couldn't even do church.
Right. 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 And that kind of leads me to, we know, like, when it comes to colonialism, when it comes to slavery, um, we fought these things every step of the way, right? But a lot of times the history gets told um, by the quote unquote victor, and it's told in a way that our fighting spirit is often left out of the tale, the story. When we think about apartheid in South Africa, can you talk about some of the key movements and figures that raised hell fighting against South African apartheid?
So that's actually a great segue into that topic because again, like you said, the victors tend to write the history. So we know the mainstream narrative of South Africa is Nelson Mandela tends to be the predominant figure, precisely because he's portrayed as being this forgiving type
Mm,
of loving figure that once he came to power, he was willing to forgive the white people and just let them keep the land and all of those kind of things. And what gets left out of that narrative, what gets written out of the narrative, are more militant figures. People like Winnie Mandela, who was
hmm
much more aggressive in terms of pursuing armed struggle, was not as willing to compromise with the white colonial settlers, but even other people such as Steve Biko. And Steve Biko has a particular approach to the situation in South Africa, where he felt like he had organized the Black consciousness, this movement, because he felt like an important part of combating white supremacy is the psychological element of white supremacy. So he was talking about uplifting the consciousness of Black people in South Africa. Robert Sobukwe and the Pan Africanist Congress often get left out of the history as well because, unlike the ANC, the position of the PAC is that the land belongs to African people and that there can't be any justice in South Africa until African people have full control of their land again. So those are some important historical figures in South Africa that often gets left out of the mainstream narrative of the history, particularly the narrative that we get in the United States. Anton Lembede actually is my personal favorite
hmm
figure in that history because Lembede was an African nationalist. His ideas influenced both the Pan African Congress and Steve Biko's movement. He was an African nationalist who not only believed that African people needed to be firmly in control of South Africa, but he also recognized the psychological elements of the colonization of African people in South Africa, to the point where when you read Nelson Mandela's autobiography, he actually credits Lembede with elevating his own consciousness. Mandela was one of those Africans who believed that the solution was that Africans in South Africa needed to be more English. They needed to adopt English culture, English mannerisms. And Mandela admitted that Lembede was actually somebody who got Mandela out of that framework and essentially helped Mandela move into a more militant trajectory. Again, because the narrative of Mandela is this elderly statesman figure who was very forgiving of white people. We tend to lose sight of the fact that he was in prison all those years because he was engaged in armed struggle.
Right.
That he wasn't loving and forgiving, and that got him landed in prison. He was actually engaged in armed struggle, and Lembede played a role in elevating his consciousness. So the reason why I mentioned Lembede is because I feel like he even in South Africa, I don't know if his legacy really gets acknowledged in the way that it should, because he really helped to shape that whole liberation struggle in a more militant direction.
Yeah, like when we even when we talk about here, right, and we talking about revolution and we talk about um, ideas of revolution in the world that we want to see, I don't really feel like it can happen without. I mean, as much as you would like to, unify the working class or this and that, without Black people having an elevating our conscious, having a knowledge of self, I just don't see that. I, I feel like they go hand in hand, right? Like a revolution and a sense of self, knowledge of self, um, elevating how you view yourself, how you view the world, kind of getting back to the world view that was taken from you through colonialism and slavery. Like whenever you think about revolution, how important is consciousness? Because even like whenever we look at the Haitian Revolution and Boukman's prayer, and he's like, "Hey, get rid of that white god," right? Like, you know, how important is elevating the consciousness of the people in regards to revolution and freedom, justice, and equality for the oppressed.
It I don't know if I should say it's the most important, because when we're talking liberation, it's a holistic exercise. So you really need to liberate people on every front. But I think certainly if you were to list what should be the most important, I would say that would be the most important. And even you made the point about class and where that plays into the component of revolution. Anton Lebede was very clear in this, that he saw the liberation struggle in South Africa as a racial struggle, and his position on that was that African people are oppressed as a race, not as a class. That even
Hmm.
African people who are, so-called petty bourgeoisie, middle class, they might not necessarily be working class, but they're still. I mean, in the system of apartheid, they were still oppressed. It didn't matter what your social status was as an African, as long as you were an African, you weren't equal to white person. So part of why the psychological component of liberation is important is because the dynamics of what African people are dealing with are different than what the white working class is dealing with. Kwame Ture made the point that poor white people are oppressed, but African people are colonized.
Hmm.
And the distinction was that African people being colonized, not only are we oppressed within a class system, within a capitalist system, but part of the colonization is that our whole culture has been stripped from us. That the white working class still gets to participate in what is their culture, European culture, Eurocentric culture. African people, regardless of which class you're in, we're totally alienated from our culture. And matter of fact, the further up you go in terms of the class system, is the more alienated an African becomes from culture, because it's almost a situation where to really get into those ruling circles, you need to be as further removed from African culture as possible. So that means speaking a particular way, carrying yourself a particular way. You need to be further removed from your culture to even be elevated in those spaces. So as I said, there's a different component to our liberation struggle, and I think Marxist theories that look at the situation as being a class struggle, I think lose sight of the important element of the psychological nature of
Hmm.
colonization, and lose sight of the cultural aspect and how the cultural aspect plays into psychological aspect. So again, South Africa, because of the fact that the apartheid system was very clearly a racist system in the way that Jim Crow was a racist system. I think that kind of created a viewpoint of the Africans in South Africa of understanding that primarily what they were fighting was a racial liberation struggle, and that even if there was a class component, the class component had to be secondary to the racial struggle, because ultimately what apartheid and Jim Crow was the same way. Ultimately, what that created was a system where even poor white people had certain social advantages and a higher degree of
Yeah.
influence than affluent black people.
Yeah, like even like we think about during our Mafa and enslavement, um, you know, Southern peasants, they still weren't enslaved, right? They still had freedoms to get married and have families, and they didn't have any money. They didn't have any upward mobility. They had the idea that one day they too could become slave owners, but that wasn't like but that's not chattel slavery. We were in bondage, not even seen as human beings, and so yeah, you're right. Like I always, that's why I ask you that, because I don't like when people attempt to strip our struggle from the racial component, right? Because especially people who haven't experienced what we have experienced, it just makes no sense to me. When it comes to movements that were were fighting against South African apartheid, um, what role do you think global solidarity movements played in ending apartheid? And in hindsight, like how would you assess their impact? Because from Malcolm, Martin, the Panthers, uh, students on college campuses, hip hop artists like um, hip hop artists, uh, soul singers make songs about South African apartheid. What's the word? Johannesburg. I want to say Stetsasonic had a song. But like so.
Stevie Wonder, his music was banned from South Africa
Oh
for
wow, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
Stevie Wonder, right, 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 right. So his music was banned before we get to that. His music was banned from South
yeah,
Africa.
from because he was yes, denouncing South African apartheid
Shout
in his
out
music. So
Stevie.
he's actually he's banned from South
Yeah, shout out
Africa.
Stevie. That's even more reason that he's the GOAT. But like, so what role would you say global solidarity, especially from the diaspora, played in the impact on dismantling South African apartheid, or at least bringing awareness to it?
No, but it was a huge role. So I mean, you mentioned artists. Our artists played a significant role in terms of raising awareness, and also not just in terms of raising awareness, but also raising the morale and the spirits of people who are fighting apartheid. Because it's a situation where when you're struggling against apartheid and you're seeing prominent musicians, in the United States, some in the Caribbean as well. Peter Tosh, Bob Marley, those artists sang
Mm-hmm.
about that. It was something that was very inspiring and uplifting to people who are on the ground engaging in that struggle. But more so than just raising awareness, the international support was very very necessary. For example, the United States placing sanctions on South Africa over apartheid, that was done through the efforts of African Americans actually organizing and lobbying on behalf of the liberation struggle in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, in his autobiography, mentions how the people in South Africa were getting military support, logistical support, funding as well. A lot of Africans in the diaspora were giving financing to the liberation struggle. So really, what it is on all levels of the liberation struggle in South Africa, there was support on the international level from the diaspora. And yeah, I don't think that struggle wouldn't have been what it was if it wasn't for that level of international
Mm.
support and the level of international solidarity. But it played a very huge role, not just in South Africa. I mean, we could look at the global African liberation struggle and how the global nature of that struggle, definitely helped to shape that movement. But particularly since we're talking about South Africa would be one of the great examples of why Pan Africanism becomes important. And also, it was important again, not just in the context of what it was that Black people were doing to support South Africa's struggle, but also look at it from the context of white supremacy being a global system and the fact that apartheid couldn't sustain itself as long as it did if it wasn't for the international support that the apartheid regime in South Africa was getting from the United States and getting from Britain, to the
Mm.
point where the CIA was actually feeding the government in South Africa information on how to track down certain individuals, certain revolutionaries that the government was tracking down, including Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, wow. And earlier before the show, like I was kind of looking at just a lot of, how we were speaking on the artists. Many artists, uh, you know, many black artists boycotted during the time and would not perform in South Africa. And there were also some black artists that broke the boycott. And I guess that's to be expected. But what I came across whenever I was looking at that is uh, the role South African artists played, and I don't know much about many of them, but I just think it's important to put a little caveat to share is that you know South African artists protested apartheid through their art with music, murals, posters, graffiti, artwork, sculptures, like all kind of things, right? And like it's funny that graffiti obviously was mentioned in the article that I read, graffiti being one of the elements of hip hop. And we're living in a time where there's so much going on in the world, but if you listen to the music, you would think everybody's rich and living the life. Um, and there's so much going on, right? There's so much going on. And just, like, what role do you think art plays in bringing awareness to oppression and Pan Africanism, Pan African struggle? The things that are going on within our communities. What role do you think art plays in that?
It can play a very important role in terms of educating the masses of people, elevating consciousness. I could tell you just from my own journey, certain artists that I listen to played a big role in shaping my consciousness and how I understand the conditions that African people are facing. But the thing about your point that when you listen to the music almost doesn't reflect the conditions of the people. From my observation, based on studying this history, that typically when you find artists making conscious music, making music that reflects the struggles and aspirations of the people, it's because there was a movement that was influencing the artist. That
Mm,
our art is always influenced
yeah,
by a social
true.
movement. So, and I mean, I could give numerous examples. For example, Bob Marley. I mentioned Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, and I think we often take it for granted that whole movement, that era of reggae music, that wasn't just something that happened. That was a reflection of the fact that there was a Black Power movement going on in
Hmm.
Jamaica, going on throughout the Caribbean. The Black Power movement led to a resurgence of Garveyism. So we see, the rise of Garveyism and Garvey's ideas being influenced in the reggae music, and the fact that being a Rasta itself was a political movement.
Yeah,
Because of reggae, I
it
think
was anti-colonial to its
it was
core.
anti-colonial movement. So Bob Marley being Rasta, he was already part of an anti-colonial movement in addition to all the other influences that were going on. Hip hop was the same thing in the United States. When we talk about the golden age of hip hop, when artists who were socially conscious were actually in the mainstream. People like Public Enemy, Chuck D actually getting, because I mean we think about it, an artist now, rapping about the kind of things Chuck D was rapping about, to some of those artists rapping about, you're not gonna see them on MTV, or you're not gonna
Nah.
hear that on the radio. It's not mainstream, but that was mainstream at the
Yeah.
time. So I think it's important to to make that point that the golden age, that wasn't just a time where rappers were actually rapping about these topics, but the fact that it was actually mainstream. That
Yeah.
you could turn on the TV and see the music videos or listen to it on radio. It had mainstream coverage, but what was important about that movement is you have to look at the influences. What were those artists being influenced by? And I mean, the influences were very clear. The remnants of the civil rights movement, the remnants of the Black Power movement, even certain other movements as well that I don't think necessarily get the type of recognition that they deserve in shaping the consciousness of hip hop at the time. And I'm referring to the Nation of Islam's influences,
Mhm.
Five Percenters, Nation of Gods and Arts. Those are big influences in the music, to the
Absolutely.
point where I would say probably a majority of the artists rapping about those things at the time were five percenters, to show
Yeah.
how it. that movement was. So, and it's the same thing, like, the Rastas being influential in reggae and shaping the consciousness of those artists. The 5%ers were very influential in shaping the consciousness of those artists. So that these are artists who are just making conscious music because they're making conscious music. They're actually connected to real movements,
Yeah.
connected to real organizations, connected to things that are elevating um, their consciousness, and that's reflected in the music. So nowadays, when we look at these artists, and we're thinking, well, why aren't artists rapping about things or singing about things that reflect the conditions of the people? Well, where are the social movements? Where are the things that
Right.
artists can actually go and get connected to really not only elevate their consciousness, but also to be connected to what the masses of the people are dealing with. We saw this briefly with Black Lives Matter and with Colin Kaepernick protesting the national anthem. For a brief moment, we saw certain artists, taking more,
Yeah.
I would say, militant positions. Beyonce with New Formation, and
Hmm.
the Black Panther tribute at the Super Bowl. So we did see for a brief period artists kind of taking on those type of what I say aesthetics, more
Yeah.
Black Power aesthetics. But why I say aesthetics is because it wasn't backed by a particular movement. So when the energy died down, we see a lot of these artists going back to the same things that they were doing before. But that's why having these type of movements are important. Another example I mentioned is Fela Kuti. Like Fela Kuti,
Absolutely.
when you look at his history, part of what influenced him to make the type of music he was making was the background that he came from. His mother, Fumilayo Kuti, being a very prominent Pan African activist in Nigeria, but
Hmm.
also the Black Power movement. That Fela Kuti, when he was living in the United States, he was influenced by the Black Power movement, and he took that back to Nigeria. Now, the reason why I mentioned Fela Kuti in this context is a Nigerian artist coming to the United States now. What movement is happening in the United States that they could take back to Nigeria and build on? There's no Black Power
Yeah.
movement.
Black capitalism.
Black capitalism is really what we have. So that's why to answer your question about the role of art, art is very important. But if you don't have the necessary political and social movements in place, you're not going to get the type of revolutionary artists that we had before. So I think you need to build those movements
Mhm.
before you can actually see the artist making music that reflects the conditions of the people. Otherwise, we'll get what you're talking about. Then it's very deliberate. You'll get a situation where the people are struggling, but you don't see that or you don't feel that in the mainstream music. What the
Right.
music is giving you is black capitalism, everything is okay. Or if things aren't okay, the solution is black capitalism and just work really hard and build up your finances.
Yeah.
Was it Jay-Z said? Jay-Z said, "What's better than one billionaire? Two black billionaires."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, so
Yeah.
just produce more black billionaires. That'll be
Yeah.
the solution.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Jay. Well, when we think about, all right, so like when it comes to South Africa, the reason that even kind of the what sparked me to want to do this show was Donald Trump publicly, criticizing South Africa and their land back policies, and um, obviously, I think this is a reflection of Elon Musk being in his ear. I don't even think Trump is that intelligent enough to even have that on his radar. But um, like, what are your thoughts on Elon Musk being in Trump's ear, criticizing, the South Africa's expropriation act, which allows land expropriation without compensation.
I think that's exactly what it is. I think it's Elon being in Trump's ear because Elon being South African and also white supremacist. I think what we're seeing with Elon and a lot of white supremacists when they think about South Africa, just like how white supremacists in the United States long for the days of Jim Crow. And I think part of what making America great again is making America what that was.
Yeah.
Jim Crow was. It's the same thing with Elon and white South Africans like that. I think for them it's make white South Africa great again. They're upset about apartheid no longer being in place, and they long for the days of apartheid. They long for the days when white people had much more power and influence in South Africa than they have. So I think what we're seeing with what Elon is trying to influence Trump to do is basically a situation of essentially bullying South Africa and punishing South Africa for the fact that South Africa actually dared to stand up and fight against apartheid and to overturn white minority rule. So, I mean, part of what Trump is doing is cutting off aid to South Africa, cutting off that funding. That's part of the bullying tactic of, well, if you're not going to do what I want you to do, I'm just going to withdraw, the money. I'm going to withdraw the finances that you rely on. And I think that's why Thomas Sankara clearly understood that African governments cannot rely on foreign aid from the
Mm,
West because that aid comes with conditions, and we're seeing that happen
absolutely.
with South Africa. So that's what Elon is trying to push. Basically just punish South Africa for the fact that South Africa is no longer an apartheid state. But also, it's just the double standard is interesting because it's a problem for Africans in South Africa to reclaim the land that belonged to them that Europeans actually came and stole. But when we look at what's happening with Israel and Gaza,
Mhm.
somehow it's okay for Europeans who are not even from the area to go
Right.
there and take land that never belonged to them, but they claim it on the basis of having a religious connection to the land. And not only is the Trump administration okay with that, the Trump administration says that America is actually going to go and oversee the process. So we're just going to go over there. We're going to station troops in Gaza, take over Gaza, and basically annex Gaza so it belongs to the United States, so that
Mm.
the United States can oversee the resettlement process in Gaza. So it's that clear double standard of Europeans are free to just go wherever in the world and take land, but African people can't even take back land that belonged
Can't
to us.
even yeah, can't even take what's rightfully theirs back. I saw some people saying that when the story first came out about Trump and his comments about withholding aid to South Africa was because that South Africa is a BRICS nation. But I don't think that has anything to do with it. I literally think it's about Elon being in his ear and attempting to protect white colonizers from giving back what they stole.
Yeah, I think
Because wouldn't
I
other
think that
BRICS
yeah.
nations wouldn't he say something about other BRICS nations if that was the case?
Yeah, I think I mean the BRICS thing. I think could be part of it. I've also seen people talk about South Africa and bringing those charges against Israel. That could be a part of it. But
Mm-hmm.
really, what it is as long as Elon is having influence in the administration, that was going to happen anyways. Because memory, I don't know if you recall Elon having the dispute with Malema
Yeah,
over that Boer song that Elon
yeah,
doesn't like. So
KTB.
yeah, yeah. So Elon already had issues with the things that are taking place in South Africa in terms of not just longing for apartheid, but having issues with the fact that the people who dominate South Africa's politics are people like Malema, people who are not sympathetic to the white plight in South Africa. But I mean, where Malema is concerned, the the land reform hasn't been aggressive enough, and that's the interesting thing about what's happening in South Africa that South Africa has tried to move very slowly, almost to the point where I know a lot of people have actually criticized how slowly South Africa has been moving to reclaiming the African land. I know a lot of people feel like South Africa should have already done what Mugabe did in Zimbabwe, just
Mm,
take the land. And I think
mm,
part of what the Trump administration is doing is basically punishing South Africa. And I think the end goal is to basically reduce South Africa to what they did with Zimbabwe in terms of just
mm.
completely wrecking the economy and punishing the nation for not being a white minority ruled nation anymore.
Yeah, and
So,
also kind of
yeah,
send a message, right? Like this is what happens whenever you attempt to fight against colonialism or neo-colonialism or anything that the
man,
West is doing.
and that's the thing about the Western imperialism. They're gangsters in that way. That's exactly what they do. I mean, Haiti. They didn't have to destroy Haiti's economy. They did it to send a message to other colonial nations. This is what happens if you stand up to us. Guinea, when Sekou Touré decided he was going to go ahead and reject French colonialism and declare Guinea's independence, they did the same thing to Guinea. They deliberately wrecked the economy to send a signal to the other French colonies that if you decide to pursue independence, this is what's going to happen to you.
Mm,
So
mm,
Zimbabwe was the same thing, and actually, I think Zimbabwe was the reason why the West destroyed Zimbabwe's economy in the way they did through sanctions was more or less a warning to South Africa that if you pursue the same aggressive land reform measures where you just completely take the land away from white people, this is what's going to happen to you. Now with Elon, being in the position of influence he's in, I think really what they're trying to do is just shut down any form of land reform in South Africa. And basically, I mean, I'm sure if Elon had his way, reverse the situation where instead of stop taking land from white people, reverse it, and actually start giving the land back to the white people, giving positions back to white people. So, try to rebuild apartheid, I think, is what Elon really wants.
Man, I wouldn't be surprised because you see, he was already, talking about kicking Africans and Muslims out of Europe and make Europe great again.
Yeah, make
And
Europe, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, make Europe great again. And his particular concern is he doesn't want Germany to feel ashamed of
I saw
their past.
that. I saw that.
He wants Germany to be proud of their Nazi past, proud of Hitler.
And yeah, I saw that. I saw that clip that he gave at that speech in Germany, and I was like, man, he's a full blown 100% white supremacist. But what would you expect, right? He was born in apartheid South Africa. His father didn't he have like some type of mine in South Africa? Like he's literally an apartheid baby.
Yeah, I mean, from what his father said, Elon's grandparents actually moved to South Africa because they were sympathetic towards the Nazis and they were in full support of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So, and I mean, really think about the psychology behind this. I'm going to relocate to a country because that's how much I approve of the way they're oppressing black people. I
Mm.
mean, that's essentially what they did. They moved to
Golly.
South Africa to support apartheid. Can you imagine? I'm going to move to a country because I love the way they're oppressing our group of people.
Right. Wow. Wow. I love the way you handle your Negroes over there. I gotta go get be a part of that, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's essentially what Elon's grandparents did.
Damn. Damn. How did the legacy of apartheid influence the rise of movements like the economic freedom fighters?
So that movement, really, what that movement was about is the fact that even though apartheid officially is done in South Africa, there's still a lot of issues in terms of, last I checked, I don't know if this has changed, but South Africa actually ranks as the most unequal country in the world in terms of the levels of wealth inequality. So there's a lot of frustration in South Africa over the fact that, I mean, yeah, there's no more apartheid, there's no more white minority rule, but things are fine there. There's still a lot of significant inequality. African people are still oppressed in South Africa to the point where there was a situation a few years ago. I don't know if you're aware of this, where there was a protest at a mine, workers demanding better conditions, and the police were actually sent to suppress the protest, which included shooting at the protesters. And that was troubling to me because I think this was about 2012 when this happened, and it was troubling because it's not the type of thing that we used to see during the apartheid
Mm.
regime, where
Hmm.
African people rising up to demand better conditions and just send the police out to go suppress them violently. That's the very thing that the apartheid regime did. So it was disturbing to see that in post-apartheid South Africa, those kind of things are still happening. So, know, the EFF and similar movements like that in South Africa, part of their frustration is the fact that they don't feel like enough has been done to address the inequality, that ending apartheid wasn't enough. And that's why it's important that I mentioned people like Steve Biko, people like Robert Sobukwe, people who understood that what we're fighting against isn't just ending apartheid. We need to completely restructure the whole society, particularly Steve Biko. Steve Biko made a point that if we just change the color of the face of people in power, and we don't change the system, we're going to have the same system. It's just going to be run with black faces instead of white faces. And now this is where the class analysis does become important. So remember earlier, I was saying how when we talk about our particular condition of African people, we have to view it as a racial struggle, but there is a class component. In South Africa is where we see that class component. And where the class component comes in is that, unfortunately, within the ANC, a lot of the people who are fighting apartheid were basically fighting apartheid because they wanted a piece of the action. They wanted to get in there and to benefit from the exploitation of their people. So, unfortunately, when the ANC came to power, a lot of the political leaders who were fighting apartheid ended up enriching themselves at the expense of creating a society where there was, a great deal of wealth inequality. So, part of the legacy of apartheid isn't just a system of white minority rule, but a system of ruthless capitalistic exploitation of the masses of African people. And even though the white rule might be gone, we still have the same
Yeah.
capitalist system breeding that inequality. So what Malema has been advocating for is really restructuring society in a way where there's more of an equitable distribution of resources.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on Julius Malema?
I don't know, to be honest, because I know there are a lot of South Africans who don't trust him. They think he's an opportunist. They don't believe that he's sincere in the things that he's advocating for. There's also some questions about the ideology of his the EFF, because they have a lot of Marxist Leninist influences. So there's a history of African people being skeptical of Marxism-Leninism, any type of Marxist theory. Yeah, like I said, there's a history behind that that I think it should be a separate discussion. I don't really want to
Yeah.
get now, but from what I've seen, there's a lot of skepticism around him, around the organization, the ideology behind the organization. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who really support what he's doing because they see him as being somebody who's a very uncompromising advocate for the rights of African people in South Africa, particularly his Pan-Africanism, his vision for a unified Africa. So I know a lot of people are supportive of Malema for the things that he's expressing and his vision. But like I said, it's difficult for me to really assess what he's about because as I pointed out, there's a lot of South Africans who are skeptical about what he represents and unfortunately, I think there's good reason to be skeptical because, especially in South Africa, I mean, coming from the history of the ANC leading the anti-apartheid struggle, only to come into power and seeing what the ANC has become in terms of corruption, I could understand why people in South Africa would be skeptical of Malema, especially
Yeah.
since Malema was in the ANC. So the EFF is actually a breakaway from the ANC because of the internal conflict within the ANC. So it's also the question of, as I pointed out, is he an opportunist? Is he doing this because he sees an opportunity to take power away from the ANC at some point, or is he actually genuine about building the type of society that he's advocating for? I think, unfortunately, the only way we could ever know for sure is a situation where the EFF actually wins majority power in South Africa and Lima becomes the president. At that point, I guess we get to see what he's
Real
really
time.
about.
Yeah.
I mean, because that's the thing. It's easy to say certain things, but really, when people in positions of power is when you see what they're about. So I just, my position on Malema is I like a lot of what he advocates for, but I do understand why South Africans would be skeptical of what he's trying to do, particularly given their history of being sold out by certain political leaders who seemed genuine when they were fighting apartheid and went in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I
Absolutely.
mean that should be familiar to African people here in the United States. How many people from the 60s, 70s era of that struggle ended up selling out when they were in position?
Becoming Republican, like all
Yeah,
types of yeah, 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 yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So
We've
so I
seen
think it's given our history as a people, there's always good reason to be skeptical of anybody who's advocating those things.
yeah, absolutely. Brother Dwayne, man. Again, it's always a pleasure to build with you, my brother. Thank you for coming through. It's been a awesome discussion. Everybody, if you haven't already, man, just Google Dwayne Omowale and go grab a couple of his books, man. He's written over 20. How many? How many? What are you at now?
Oh man, I have to stop and think about it. I think 25.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
He
25.
so it's a lot. I have a lot. And I want you guys, just support. Um, he's a great author, great writer, great thinker. I will have the links for everything in the description. Brother Dwayne, again, like I said, it's always an honor to have you on, bro.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, my brother.